Hey there, I'm Marcus Vogt, and you're listening to Embrace Our Calling, the podcast for Christians pursuing purpose with passion. So, you know that feeling when you're super passionate about your work, when you feel like you have found your sweet spot, where your talents meet a real need. Isn't that amazing? But here's the thing, sometimes that same passion can lead us to a really tough place. So, today I'm kicking off a special 3-part series on something that we don't talk about enough as Christians, the dark side of calling, which is burnout. And so in this first episode, we'll explore what burnout actually feels like, especially for purpose-driven folks like us. And in episode 2, we will unpack a framework for recovery from burnout that I call GRACE, Grace. In our final episode, we will dive deep into the biblical practice of Sabbath as the ultimate solution to burnout. So let me share something from my own journey. And here I want to be really honest with you about a time where I went through a burnout in my life. If I can use one phrase to describe how burnout feels like for me, it is this feeling that nothing I do seems to matter anymore. Now, all my efforts at work and in life, they just don't make a difference. And it leads to a kind of despair, hopelessness that is hard to shake it off. And I find myself just clocking in and out of work, clocking in and out of life, and there seemed to be no way out of this. I also catch myself saying the same phrase over and over in my head. I'm so burnt. I'm so burnt. Have you felt like that before? It feels like I'm just literally burned from within myself, and there's no energy, there's no reserve left for me to run on anymore, and it feels terrible. And as a teacher, I would often feel overwhelmed by work and also by that inner expectation that I'm supposed to deliver lesson in a certain way or be prepared up to a certain level. And when I feel that I'm not prepared enough or the outcome wasn't what I expected, I feel incompetent, I feel drained, and I feel exhausted. And something is that this kind of negative messages that play in my mind during my burnout, they work like a vicious cycle. It spirals me down into a state of despair, because the more I think that nothing matters, the more I think that whatever I do doesn't make a difference, the less energy I have to try, which leads to poorer results, and which then confirm that nothing I do matters. And so breaking this vicious cycle is incredibly difficult when you are in the midst of it. So what exactly is burnout? Let me share some research that really helped me to understand what I was experiencing at that time. Dr. Christine Maslach, who is one of the world's leading researchers on burnout, defines burnout as a psychological syndrome that involves 3 key dimensions. The first one is emotional exhaustion. Emotional exhaustion is where you feel depleted, used up with nothing more to give. The second dimension is depersonalization, which is when you become detached and cynical and you start to treat people as objects. The third one is reduced personal accomplishment, which is where you feel ineffective, like nothing you do matters. So obviously, I was struggling very much with the third dimension. But does any or all of this sounds like what you are experiencing? If you are, then maybe you are also experiencing some degree of burnout. And there are actually burnout assessment tests out there that you can take to see if you're experiencing some degrees of burnout. And I will put the links in the description. Now, let me talk about some myths and misconceptions about burnout. There are several misconceptions about burnout that I think we need to address here. The first is that many people think that burnout is just being tired. And that it is something that can be solved with some self-care or going on a break or going on a holiday. Sometimes it is not that simple. The exhaustion of burnout goes much deeper than just physical fatigue. Second, there is a belief that individuals are fully responsible for their own burnout. But very often, burnout is a systemic issue. People working in organizations with unhealthy expectations or cultures, they are much more vulnerable to burnout. This is something that employers and organizational leaders need to be mindful of. And the third is especially for Christians, that there's this idea that burnout reflects a lack of faith or discipline. Like, if you were just trusting God more or managing your time better, you wouldn't burn out. But I've read about professors who have taken sabbaticals and still return feeling unable to teach. I've known dedicated Christians who were faithful in their spiritual discipline and yet they still experience burnout. So the reality is that burnout is complex and it is not fully understood even by experts. But what we do know is that burnout is not just some personal failure or spiritual weakness, but it is a human response to a prolonged stressful situation and impossible expectation. All this to say that it is not like we choose to feel burnt out. When burnout happens, it is often not by choice. It is tough to just make it go away. And when there's no empathy or understanding from others, it becomes even more painful. What I want to highlight in this episode is this, that when you are passionate about your work, when you truly believe that it is your calling, it gets harder to set healthy boundaries for yourself. So think about this. If you are working a job that you don't really care about, it is pretty easy to clock out at 5 p.m. and just forget about it. But what if your work feels like an extension of your faith, when you believe that God has equipped you specifically for this task? And that is when it gets tricky, because every extra hour will feel justified, every sacrifice will seem holy, and every boundary will feel selfish. And this is especially true for those of us who are in helping professions, such as teachers like myself, healthcare workers, ministry leaders, caregivers. We are already wired to give of ourselves. And when we add that layer of calling on top, it can become a perfect storm. So what are some warning signs of this calling-induced burnout? How do you know if you are experiencing burnout? Let me break it down for you. Physically, you might feel constantly tired. You get a lot of headaches. Your sleep is all over the place. And you catch every cold that goes around because your immune system has just broken down. Emotionally, you might feel numb or detached. Numb or detached from the people that you used to serve. Things that used to bring you joy just don't anymore, and you become more cynical and critical than usual. Spiritually, and this is a big one for us Christians, the practices that once energized you now feel like just another item on your to-do list. Your prayer feel like they are just hitting the ceiling, and God seems distant in your life. Behaviorally, you might notice yourself pulling back from responsibility. You procrastinate more, and maybe you're using food, social media, or other things to cope with the stress in your life. And so for me, one big red flag was when I started feeling resentful towards the people that I was serving. Now I caught myself thinking, although they understand how much I'm sacrificing for them, and that is when I know that something was off in my spirit. So in ministry or purpose-driven work, burnout often looks different. You question your calling entirely, thinking that, maybe I misheard God. When God feels distant or silent, where there is a growing gap between your public persona and your private reality. And you have spiritual doubts that you don't feel safe sharing with people. And you drop family responsibilities to keep up with work. Or you feel like your identity will collapse if you just step back from work. And you develop this compassion fatigue. You find it very hard to care about the very people that you're called to serve. All these are warning signs that you might be hitting a burnout wall. So let me share with you some theological perspective. You know what's fascinating about Jesus? Despite having the most important calling in history, Jesus regularly took breaks. He knew his limit as a human being and he honored them. In Mark 6 verse 31, Jesus told his disciple, "Come with me by yourself to a quiet place and get some rest." Now, this was right in the middle of their busy ministry. Now, people are constantly coming and going, and Jesus and his disciple didn't even have time to eat. Sounds familiar? Are you going through that same busyness in your life? You see, there's this dangerous idea that has crept into Christian culture Now, this idea that more sacrifice equals to more spirituality, and that when you push beyond your limit, somehow it will please God more. But when we look at scripture, we see something very different, because there is a lot of material in the Bible about people experiencing burnout. Now think about Elijah. Of course, Elijah's experience was complex, but part of it was clearly a deep sense of incompetence, insecurity, despair, and futility, or the sense of like nothing he does matter anymore. And so in his darkest moment, Elijah said to God that I'm the only one left and they are trying to kill me too. And that sounds a lot like burnout to me, on top of other things. We see glimpses of it in the Psalms that David wrote. And in creation, God himself rested on the seventh day. Not because he was tired, but he wanted to establish a rhythm for his creation. And Jesus himself constantly withdrew to pray and to rest despite the endless needs around him. And even the land itself was commanded to rest every 7 years. So, question: what if our limitations aren't obstacles to our calling, but actually part of it? What if honoring our humanity, our need for rest, for relationship, for recreation, is actually an act of worship? Isaiah 30 verse 15 speaks directly to this. In repentance and rest is your salvation. In quietness and trust is your strength. When I was burning out, this verse struck me deeply. My salvation or my deliverance wasn't in doing more, in accomplishing and finishing my work more. It is about resting and trusting. So, in this three-part series that I'm talking about, we are going to make a journey together from understanding burnout to discovering lasting solution. And so today in this episode, we have explored what burnout is and how it uniquely affects those of us who see work as a calling. We'll look at the warning signs and the misconceptions around burnout. And so in the next episode, I will share a framework for recovery that I call grace. Let me just share with you a bit about what grace means. G stands for ground yourself in God's love. R stands for recognize your humanity and limits. A stands for align with truth and community. C stands for create new rhythms and habits. And E stands for engage your calling with renewed purpose. So this gospel-centered approach offered practical steps for healing and prevention of burnout. We'll take a close look at each component and how you can apply it in your life. And then in the third episode, we will go deep into what I believe is the ultimate solution to burnout, which is the biblical practice of Sabbath. We will explore how Sabbath offers not just rest, but a complete reorientation of our relationship with work, time, and God. And I will share from my own journey of learning to keep Sabbath and how it has transformed my approach to calling. So, my dear friends, if you are seeing some of these warning signs in your life, please know that you are not alone. Burnout isn't a sign of weakness or a lack of faith. It is often the result of genuine passion that has lost its proper boundary. So, in the meantime, be gentle with yourself. If this episode hit home for you, maybe the most important thing you can do this week is to simply acknowledge where you are. And sometimes naming our reality is the first step towards changing it. This is Marcus Mock, and you're listening to Embrace Our Calling. Thank you for joining me today. Hit that subscribe button so that you don't miss the next episode in this series. And check out my website at embraceourcalling.com for more resources. In the meantime, stay joyful and let's go forth to embrace our calling in sustainable ways.